Released October 2019, the Google Pixel 4 and 4 XL brought a lot to the table over their predecessors, including a complete redesign, 90Hz display, a second telephoto camera lens, and of course, no notch. Instead, we had this very thick top bezel that features motion sense, a gesture recognition system powered by radar technology. No longer would you have to go to the incredible inconvenience of actually touching your phone, when you instead could hover your hand over the device and wave it in the air. And yes, this is about as useful as it looks. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and while the Pixel 4 was a dramatic departure from the prior 3 generations in design, not all of its changes would be for the better. Still, what we ended up with here is ultimately a unique, quirky phone that did bring a lot of interesting features for better or for worse, and 6 years later I find myself quite impressed with a lot of what's here. So today we ask the question, how does the Google Pixel 4 hold up all these years later?
New Google Pixel 4 with motion sense. It senses when you're close, unlocks, and skips without you even having to touch it. Switch to the new Google Pixel 4, a phone made the Google way.
As I stood atop Mount Shem taking in my surroundings, there was really only one thing I could think about. Man, do I ever love that orange color on my Pixel 4 XL. I mean, just look at it, it's great. Maybe I'm just a sucker for flashy colors, but like what else am I gonna think about right now? This here is the Pixel 4 XL, which unlike its predecessor is practically identical to its smaller counterpart. The smaller Pixel 4 features a 5.7-inch 1080p screen, whereas the 4 XL gives 6.3 inches at 1440p and is a bit sharper. Both panels are POLED at a 19:9 aspect ratio and have a 90Hz refresh rate, making for a nice, smooth feeling 90 frames per second in whatever you do, which I really appreciate having. It feels so much nicer to use than the Pixel 3 XL because of it, which is a phone I recently reviewed, by the way. Link in the description to that video, as well as other reviews I've done on older Pixels and Nexus phones. But 90Hz, well, nowadays we might be used to 120. Back in 2019, having anything better than 60 wasn't yet the standard, so it's really nice to see here. It helps the software experience feel fresh. And running Android 13 here, this phone still feels pretty modern. I appreciate this clean, stock Google software coming off of One UI from the Samsung side. It's a bit refreshing. I don't dislike One UI per se, but there's something about Google's take on things I've always really liked. It's just got this really clean design, and the orange wallpaper matching the phone itself just has the entire package standing out from the crowd. The thick top bezel and thinner but still substantial chin is a unique look to be sure. Google got so much backlash for that notch, it's hard to blame them for ditching it altogether, but I'm not so sure this setup is much better. That top bezel for a 2019 flagship is really darn thick. I mean, compared to the Galaxy S10 from the same year, and well, there really is no comparison, is there? The side bezels are also thicker than the ones on the Pixel 3 XL, which I find kind of odd. That's actually something I probably should have praised more with the 3 XL. While the notch is horrendously ugly, the bezels surrounding it outside of the big chin are impressively thin for the time. In a few ways, the Pixel 4 almost felt like Google was going a bit backwards. While 19:9 is not a crazy aspect ratio, the phone still feels quite tall to me because of the bezels. The sides have this matte, almost plasticky texture to them, which normally I like, but I actually think I prefer the glossy sides of the Pixel 3, and it's just not as comfortable in the hand as the Pixel 3 and 3 XL were. The design of this phone is very different from what came before. We've got a very simple flat glass backing and square camera bump featuring 2 camera lenses. For colors, we have just black, clearly white, and oh so orange. And well, we already know I've got the orange one here. I love the colored power button. It's a really nice contrast with the black frame. Sort of interestingly, the white and orange have this soft touch matte glass finish, whereas the black one is more glossy. Not sure how I feel about that. It would definitely be a fingerprint magnet, but I do appreciate the unique approach. I also really just like the glass on this phone. It's really premium feeling, it's nice. It doesn't have the same texture as the Pixel 3, and I do prefer the feel of that phone again, but this one is still nice too, and I do love that orange color. I'd probably prefer it if the orange was a little bit deeper. It looks almost salmon in my studio lighting, but trust me when I say it really does pop in person. Comparing the design of the Pixel 4 to what we now see in the Pixel 10 Pro, obviously what really stands out the most outside of the significantly reduced bezel size on the front is the huge camera setup on the back, and what's funny is, of course, the Pixel 4 was the first model to bring a second camera lens to the rear after years of Google claiming they only needed one. And hey, in fairness, back in the day, they were right. The Pixel 2 and 3 were both quite a bit ahead of the game in photography, and the pictures those phones are capable of capturing still hold up surprisingly well today. So let's go ahead and move into the cameras, which always has been the highlight of every new Google Pixel. On the front of the Pixel 4, we've got a single 8-megapixel selfie camera. No extra ultra-wide lens here, like on the 3 and 3 XL, but this still delivers a wide enough image, and the quality is just as good as you would expect from Pixels of the era. Video in up to 1080p 30 is not great. That's crazy to me that 60 FPS isn't an option somehow, but the still shots are great. And of course, it's the rear cameras we're really interested in anyways. We've got for the first time on Pixel those two lenses, the main 12.2 megapixel wide lens that we were familiar with, and then the all-new 16 megapixel telephoto lens offering 2x zoom. This was a very noteworthy addition, not just because Pixels had only one camera before, but also because 2019 was a year where most flagship smartphones were adding ultra-wide options. While a 2x telephoto may or may not have been a better choice than an ultra-wide depending on your personal preference, there's no question that it wasn't as exciting in 2019 as an ultra-wide would have been. And at least from my memory, there was far less hype behind this phone and its cameras compared to the iPhone 11 Pro and its, for the time, very new and novel tri-camera setup. The good news here is that the Pixel 4 was still pretty top of the line in photography when it came out and can take stunning images, both in the right conditions as well as even in lower light. It definitely holds its own pretty well for a 6-year-old smartphone. An ultra-wide lens, yeah, it would have been nice, but at least we do have some fun added versatility here with the new telephoto lens, and I think both cameras produced pretty impressive results. There's just something about the color tone and sharpness in the pictures Pixels of this era took that just has always really appealed to me. They look great, and if you wanted the best smartphone camera on the market, the Pixel 4 would have been a very tempting option. But of course, not having a third lens, not having an ultra-wide camera, it did reduce its appeal compared to something like the iPhone 11 Pro. In classic Google fashion, this phone took some positive steps, but also just didn't do enough to make it a no-brainer purchase or pull ahead of the rest of the crowd. Video is also an area Google just really wasn't that good with around this time. We can only record in 4K 30, and it doesn't look great, especially compared to what iPhone video was capable of back in 2019. Even so, a lot of people would have still considered the Pixel 4 the king of still images, and for good reason. Google did do a fantastic job here, and whatever magic is being pulled off by the so-called Pixel Neural Core is doing pretty dang good. Google's software processing was so ahead of the game for photography it was nuts, and again, the cameras are what hold up the best on the Pixel 4 and 4 XL, just like with what we found on the Pixel 2 and 3. Where we start to feel the age of this phone is when we get to the rest of the hardware and software, as well as all that wild radar tech crammed inside. Powered by the Snapdragon 855 chipset and 6GB of RAM, the Pixel 4 and 4 XL originally shipped on Android 10 with either 64 or 128GB of internal storage, receiving updates through to Android 13. For networking, the Pixel 4 did not have any 5G compatibility, only up to 4G LTE, as 5G would really hit it big with smartphones the next year and was included on the Pixel 5. Unfortunately, we don't have any micro SD card slot or anything like that. Would have been nice with only up to 128 gigs, and I do note this because with the Pixel 4, Google did away with their free, unlimited, full-resolution Google photo storage that had come with their first 3 generations. You did get a 3-month trial of Google One that included 100 gigs of cloud storage, but this was obviously nowhere near the same thing. Pixel 3 owners, on the other hand, would continue to have free, full-res Google Photos until 2022. This was undoubtedly done to save a bunch of money on Google's end, as they likely figured they had gained a proper footing in the smartphone market and didn't need to be quite as aggressive in marketing incentives. But Google might have been a bit overconfident, and I doubt it helped long-term sales, with the Pixel 4 failing to reach the same numbers as the 3rd generation, and Pixels as a whole would be on the decline over the next couple years. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit though. The hardware here was pretty standard for a 2019 flagship. The 6 gigs of RAM especially was a much needed upgrade over only 4 gigs in the Pixel 3, and it helped this phone stay quite spiffy even on its final software updates. I think this phone probably could easily run further than Android 13, honestly. It felt pretty fast when navigating around the UI and performing any basic task, but of course it could struggle as soon as you throw anything more intensive at it. Overall, you can probably download most apps and do most things. Android 13 is still fairly capable, so if you had to, yeah, you probably could use this phone today, though I don't think you'd want to, both because it's so old and also because battery life. The battery in the smaller Pixel 4 is 2800 mAh, whereas the Pixel 4 XL does have a much larger 3700 mAh. This bigger phone would definitely get you more life, though it's hard to see any Pixel 4 still holding up well in this department after all these years, as batteries do degrade over time. What's maybe more interesting to talk about is all the radar gimmick stuff, and the motion sense features that came along with it. So basically, Google had developed their own Soli radar, as they called it, which used radio waves to sense you and any gestures you might be making. This would allow for things like waving your hand over the phone to change music tracks or silence an incoming phone call, along with some other mostly meaningless features. I mean, let's be real here. What's easier, waving your hand over your phone to skip to the next song, or just, tapping the skip button on the screen? There might be some scenarios where you're cooking or something, or wearing gloves and you don't want to actually touch your phone, but the vast majority of the time this was just going to be more trouble than it was worth. The Samsung Galaxy S4 all the way back in 2013 actually had done something similar, so this wasn't a completely new or unique idea, but Google had definitely gone an interesting route to get there. The problem here with motion sense wasn't so much the tech itself. Heck, if anything, I'd say it was all quite impressive. The issue was none of this really made for a better device, and if anything, only added compromises that hurt the Pixel 4, like the big top bezel, or how much time and effort went to this whole gimmick instead of making something more worthwhile. Now, one thing we did get that actually was pretty solid was Google's Face Unlock, which works similarly to Apple's Face ID, and while it's not as good as Apple's version, it is almost surprisingly consistent and quick. It usually worked pretty well. I like it, though just a regular fingerprint reader would have been just as fine, and probably would have been a whole lot less trouble to go to. The Pixel 4 and 4 XL, looking at them with the power of hindsight, man, these are very strange phones. I'd go so far as to call them experimental, which is respectable in a certain sense. I generally am going to appreciate it when a company takes a bold new direction and risk, because I feel like we don't really see experimental flagships as much anymore. Most new phone generations always tend to play it safe. But there is a reason for that. Sometimes when trying to move forwards, you can get overly committed to gimmicks that can take away from the rest of the device and its improvements. And that's exactly what happened here with all the radar tech and motion sense with the Pixel 4. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it's the Pixel way. The Pixel 2 XL blue tinted display, the Pixel 3 XL notch, the Pixel 4 has the radar crap. One thing that has the Pixel 4 and 4 XL looking even worse in hindsight comes in the form of what was supposed to be the budget model of the generation in the Pixel 4a. And I mean, just look at it. It looks like a significantly more modern phone, with those reduced bezels, a hole punch notch, plus it has the fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone, which some people would have preferred anyways. Where was all this on the flagship Pixel 4? I feel like this is what we should have gotten. Well, for some additional context, the Pixel 4a didn't actually come out until August 2020, which was almost a full year after the original Pixel 4 line launched. You also had the Pixel 4a 5G model announced in September. These phones were considered to be one of, if not the best budget smartphones of 2020, and not having all that radar crap meant Google could significantly reduce the bezel size, as well as cut a whole lot of unnecessary costs. The Pixel 4a is plastic, but it doesn't feel cheap, and even retains the headphone jack. The downsides come in a lower powered chipset, no wireless charging or water resistance, and a few other minor concessions. That 5G model does have a better processor than the non-5G variant, mind you, along with an additional 16 megapixel ultra-wide sensor on the back instead of the telephoto. You've also of course got the main 12 megapixel sensor, and the 4a 5G would get updates through to Android 14. The non-5G model would get to Android 13 just like the regular Pixel 4 and 4 XL. It's all a bit confusing, and so I'm not going to waste more time on the 4a, but basically it was almost a better phone than the Pixel 4. It's closer to the Pixel 5, I think, than it is the 4, honestly. I do think they were great budget smartphones though, bringing that best-in-class camera while trimming the fat everywhere else, and even making some major improvements like the bezel reduction. Dropping the radar stuff alone is probably the best thing they could have done. But refocusing on the Pixel 4 and 4 XL, these really are just such strange smartphones in hindsight. Google was struggling to find a proper foothold in the smartphone market, and really had been having troubles from the get-go with the first Pixel in 2016. The Pixel 3 line had been their most successful by far, no doubt aided by the Pixel 3a, but the Pixel 4 line would not continue that growth, only just cracking 5.5 million units sold. And then the Pixel 5 line would be the worst of them all, at only around 2 million units. Since 2020, Google Pixel has gone from a 1% market share in US smartphone sales all the way up to 4% in in 2025. So Google is on the upswing, relatively speaking. Considering Apple and Samsung combined makes up approximately 3 out of 4 smartphone sales, Google does have a lot of ground they need to gain in order to ever be considered on the same level, but they have made some genuine progress since the disaster of phones like the Pixel 5 and the Pixel 4. What went wrong with the Pixel 4? I'd say it's the lack of focus. The lack of focus on continuing what was making Pixels great and popular to begin with. 90Hz was a great choice, and dropping the ridiculous notch from the Pixel 3 XL did make sense, but this complete 180 to a huge top bezel and weird Face ID knockoff, instead of just continuing to have the fingerprint sensor on the rear or even just putting it on the power button, it was also unnecessary, and no doubt quite confusing to the prospective consumer. I also kinda just missed the whole classic Pixel 3, Pixel 2, Pixel 1 look, and this phone did away with that completely. It felt like this new era of Google Pixel, and it's one that was floundering for a while there. But I still like the phone. It feels spiffy moving around that clean stock Android interface at that buttery 90Hz, and while the bezels definitely make this clear that this is a somewhat older smartphone, it's difficult for me to say that it entirely feels its age. It does in a couple areas, but the actual user experience, and the photography particularly, have the phone still holding its own, and I think in a pinch, the Pixel 4 and 4 XL could still get the job done today if you were forced to use one. But you wouldn't want to use one of these anymore, just like you wouldn't want to use any phone from 6 years ago, even in cases like with the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro still getting updates including iOS 26, which is admittedly very impressive. I do think it's pretty bad the Pixel 4a 5G got to Android 14, while the other Pixel 4 models didn't, but at least it is pretty easy to flash a custom ROM onto these guys, and we can get an up-to-date experience if we went through the process of doing that. Performance would likely be middling. 6 gigs of RAM and a Snapdragon 855 chip are only going to get you so far these days, but at least we have the option to do it, unlike a lot of the Snapdragon Samsung Galaxy phones I've been looking at recently like the S7 and S8. The Pixel 4 and 4 XL, in my opinion, were mediocre smartphones that had great cameras, and they have very little legacy to speak of. But it was fun to shine the spotlight on them once again today, and in the very least, I sure love that orange color. So with that, I think we're right about done here. Did any of you ever use the Pixel 4 or 4 XL? According to the sales numbers, there's not too many of you, so very curious to hear from you if so. What did you think of the radar stuff? Was it an interesting idea that just needed some more time in the oven, or was it doomed from inception? Please make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. We do have a Discord server if you want to drop by and say hi, great community over there, and a huge shout out to the channel members for your continued support. Thank you guys so much, you're the best. And thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.